The morning light crept through the dusty window of the small courtroom, casting golden streaks across the wooden floor. A faint hum of whispers filled the room as people waited for the next case to begin. At the center stood a young black woman, her hands clasped tightly together, her eyes calm but filled with something deeper, a quiet storm that no one else could see. She wore a plain white blouse, the kind that had seen better days, yet there was something regal in the way she held herself. Across from her, the judge, an older man with graying hair and sharp eyes, adjusted his glasses and glanced at her file. "Miss Daniels," he began, his tone cold and practiced. "You've been accused of falsifying academic records and lying about your qualifications. How do you plead?" A hush fell over the courtroom. The woman looked up, her gaze steady. "Not guilty, Your Honor," she said softly. Her voice was calm, but there was a quiet confidence that made even the spectators stop whispering. The prosecutor chuckled. "Your Honor, the university believes her claims are impossible. This woman says she speaks 9 languages. 9. Yet there is no record of formal training or certification. Surely, this is another attempt to manipulate the system." The judge leaned forward, curiosity flickering in his eyes. 9 languages, he repeated, his tone half skeptical, half amused. "Miss Daniels, that's quite a claim. Can you prove it?" She nodded once. Her hands no longer trembled. "Yes, Your Honor," she said. And then she began. In perfect French, she introduced herself with grace. In Spanish, she spoke about her late mother who used to sing her lullabies in borrowed tongues. In Arabic, her words flowed like poetry, speaking of faith and struggle. Then came Mandarin, crisp, confident, flawless. Russian followed, then Swahili, German, Japanese, and finally Urdu, each word pronounced with such beauty and precision that even the interpreter sitting nearby lowered his head in disbelief. The courtroom was silent. No one moved. The prosecutor's smirk vanished. The judge sat frozen, his pen slipping from his fingers. When she finished, she looked up at him again. "Your Honor," she said quietly, "I didn't learn these languages from books. I learned them from people, from the women who cleaned houses with my mother, from the men who sold fruit on the corners, from the children who played on streets the world forgot. Every language I speak is a voice of someone who taught me how to survive." The judge's eyes softened, his breath catching in his throat. For a long moment, he said nothing. The courtroom that had once looked at her with doubt now looked at her with awe. She had not defended herself with evidence or documents, she had defended herself with truth. Finally, the judge cleared his throat, though his voice trembled when he spoke. "Case dismissed," he said quietly. "And Miss Daniels, the world could use more people who listen as well as you do." She smiled, not with pride, but with gratitude. As she walked out of the courtroom, the same sunlight that had once seemed harsh now wrapped her in warmth, like a quiet applause from the heavens. The rain fell steadily outside the courthouse, drumming against the windows like a rhythm of fate. Inside, the air was thick with tension. The young black woman stood near the witness stand, her hands folded in front of her, her heart racing beneath her calm expression. It wasn't fear that made her tremble, it was exhaustion, the kind that comes from being judged before a single word is spoken. Across the room, the judge leaned back in his chair, his robe heavy with authority and years of habit. He had seen countless defendants before, but something about her quiet composure made him curious. The prosecutor, a sharp-faced man in a gray suit, stood and began his attack. "Miss Daniels claims she speaks 9 languages," he said, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "But not a single credential supports her claim. We are expected to believe that someone from her background could master what even scholars struggle to achieve." Laughter rippled through the courtroom. The young woman didn't flinch. She simply looked at the judge and said, "Your Honor, may I speak?" The judge nodded slowly, his curiosity overcoming his doubt. She took a step forward. Her voice was soft but steady as she began speaking in French, telling a brief story about her mother working late nights so she could study. Then she shifted into Spanish, sharing how a kind neighbor taught her through old books discarded by a library. Arabic followed, her tone reverent as she recited a verse about patience. Then came Mandarin, precise and melodic. Russian, bold and rich. Swahili, warm and rhythmic. German, firm and clear. Japanese, elegant and gentle. Finally, Urdu, flowing like music. When she stopped, the courtroom was silent except for the rain tapping against the glass. The prosecutor's face had turned pale, his papers trembling in his hands. The judge leaned forward, his expression unreadable. "That was remarkable," he said softly. "But tell me, Miss Daniels, why learn all these languages?" Her eyes shimmered. "Because silence was never safe where I came from," she said. "People stopped listening to girls like me a long time ago. So I learned every language I could, hoping that somewhere, someone would finally hear me." For a long moment, the judge said nothing. Then, unexpectedly, he smiled, not mockingly, but with genuine respect. "Miss Daniels," he said, his voice gentler now, "the court owes you an apology. You've proven more than anyone here today." A murmur of approval swept through the room. Even the prosecutor lowered his head, shame flickering across his face. As the gavel struck, declaring her free, Miss Daniels stood tall, the sound of rain outside now a song of victory. She walked out of the courtroom, her head high, her reflection glowing faintly in the puddles on the steps, a woman who had turned every word of doubt into a language of power. The first time she walked into that courtroom, the young black woman felt every eye on her. The wooden benches creaked as people shifted, whispering among themselves. She stood quietly beside her public defender, her clothes plain, her expression unreadable. The prosecutor smirked, already certain of the outcome. "Your Honor," he said confidently, "this case is simple. The defendant falsified documents to gain employment. She claimed she could translate in 9 different languages. That's absurd." The judge, an older man with silver hair and a stern face, adjusted his glasses. 9 languages, he repeated, almost amused. "Is that true, Miss Daniels?" She nodded once, her voice calm. "Yes, Your Honor. It is." The courtroom erupted in soft laughter, a cruel, condescending sound. The judge raised a hand to silence them, curiosity flickering behind his composed demeanor. "Very well," he said, leaning back. "Let's see what you can do." The second scene unfolded like magic. She began to speak, her voice steady but filled with emotion. In French, she described the nights she spent studying by candlelight when the electricity was cut off. In Spanish, she spoke of her mother, who cleaned offices where she hid behind desks to practice pronunciation. Her tone shifted with every language. In Arabic, it was graceful and dignified, in Mandarin, precise and deliberate. She moved through Russian, Swahili, German, Japanese, and Urdu, each flowing like a story of survival. The interpreter in the corner stopped writing halfway through, his mouth slightly open. Even the prosecutor's arrogance began to fade, replaced by disbelief. The judge, who had started the test with a smile, now leaned forward, his eyes wide with awe. When she finished, silence swallowed the room. You could hear the hum of the fluorescent lights above, the faint crackle of the rain outside. The judge tried to speak, but the words caught in his throat. Finally, he said softly, "Where did you learn all that?" She smiled faintly. "In life, Your Honor. Each language belonged to someone who helped me survive, a neighbor, a stranger, a teacher who believed in me when no one else did. Every word I know was a gift." The third scene was quiet, but it carried the weight of 1,000 voices. The judge stood slowly, something rare for a man of his authority. He looked at her not as a defendant but as a revelation. "Miss Daniels," he said, his voice breaking slightly, "you have reminded this court of something we forget too often, that intelligence doesn't come from privilege, it comes from persistence." The prosecutor lowered his head, ashamed. The spectators, once filled with judgment, now sat in rever.